The snow fell in thick, heavy curtains as Dr. Lin Zhao squinted through her frosted eyelashes. The wind howled around her, a hungry wolf seeking entry to her layers of thermal gear. She hadn't expected the storm to hit so quickly. None of them had. We should turn back. She had suggested 3 hours earlier when the first flakes began to dance in the air. But the team had been so close to reaching the isolated village of Whitetree, and with medical supplies running dangerously low there, they had pushed forward. Lynn checked her watch. 2:17 p.m. Though the dark gray sky made it feel like evening already, they were still at least 2 hours from their destination, crawling along the narrow mountain pass that served as the only winter access to the northern settlements. "How's the road looking, Tom?" Lynn called toward the front of the vehicle, where their driver gripped the wheel with white knuckles. Tom Parker, a former military driver who had joined their Alaskan medical relief program last spring, shook his head. "Visibility's getting worse. Can barely make out where the edge is anymore." From the back seat, May, their young nurse with only 6 months of field experience, leaned forward. "I've got reception, barely. Weather Service says this blizzard's moving faster than predicted. They're calling it the worst in a decade." Lynn nodded, a knot forming in her stomach. 10 years with frontier medicine had taught her to trust her instincts in the backcountry. Right now those instincts were screaming danger. "Tom, find a place to turn around. We'll head back to the ranger station and wait it out." He nodded, relief evident in the loosening of his shoulders. "There's a wider section about half a mile ahead. Should be able to—" The world tilted suddenly. Later, Lynn would remember the sensation as similar to being inside a washing machine. A violent sideways lurch, followed by the sickening feeling of weightlessness. Their sturdy medical transport vehicle, designed for these harsh conditions, had hit a patch of black ice hidden beneath the fresh powder. In the space of 3 seconds, they slid toward the edge of the pass. Tom fought the wheel, his reactions honed by years of driving in combat zones. But physics and nature cared nothing for human skill. The vehicle teetered on the edge, suspended in that heart-stopping moment between safety and disaster, before gravity made its final claim. "Brace," Lynn shouted, instinctively throwing her arm across May's chest. The first impact against the slope knocked the wind from Lynn's lungs. The airbags deployed in an explosive burst, filling the cabin with white powder and the sharp smell of chemicals. The vehicle rolled once, twice, each rotation punctuated by the sound of breaking glass and twisting metal. Lynn's head struck something hard despite the protection of her helmet. Then stillness. A silence so profound it seemed louder than the crash itself. Lynn blinked, tasting blood where she'd bitten her lip. The vehicle had come to rest on its side, driver's side down. Wet snow was already beginning to drift in through the shattered windows. "Tom?" "May?" Her voice sounded wrong in her own ears, too quiet against the ringing. A groan from below. Tom was moving, alive at least, but no response from the back seat. Lynn twisted in her harness, fighting to see behind her. The rear door hung open, a jagged hole where May had been sitting moments before. "May!" Lynn's cry was lost in another howl of wind. The young nurse was gone, thrown from the vehicle during the roll. With trembling fingers, Lynn released her safety harness, immediately falling awkwardly against Tom. "Are you hurt badly?" Tom winced, clutching his left leg. "Broken, I think. Maybe the ankle, too. Can't move it." His face was ashen beneath his dark beard, eyes wide with the shock that often precedes pain. "Where's May?" Ejected. "I need to find her." Lynn's doctor's mind was already cataloging Tom's injuries, assessing threat levels. Broken leg, serious but not immediately life-threatening. The cold, potentially fatal within hours. May, somewhere in the snow. Critical. Lynn forced the passenger door open against the weight of accumulated snow and pulled herself out. The full fury of the storm hit her like a physical blow. The temperature had dropped well below zero, the wind chill pushing it toward 30 degrees. In these conditions, an unprotected person would develop hypothermia within minutes, frostbite shortly after. She reached back into the vehicle, grabbing her medical pack. "I'm going to stabilize that leg, then find May." Working quickly, Lynn splinted Tom's leg using the vehicle's first aid kit. Each movement was deliberate, efficient, her hands operating on muscle memory while her mind raced ahead to the next steps. Find May, signal for help, create shelter, survive. The satellite phone. Tom grunted through clenched teeth as she tightened the splint. "In my pack." Lynn found it, flipped it open. No signal. The steep mountains and heavy storm were blocking transmission. She tucked it into her inner pocket anyway, close to her body heat to preserve the battery. "I'll come back for you," she promised, pulling emergency blankets around him. "Stay put, keep as warm as possible." Tom's eyes locked with hers. "Find her quick, Doc. She's not dressed for extended exposure." Lynn nodded once sharply. She knew the odds too well. In these conditions, survival time could be measured in minutes, not hours. She stepped away from the wreck, scanning the white landscape. Their vehicle had rolled approximately 50 yards down from the road, coming to rest against a stand of pines. Above, the mountain rose in a steep, unforgiving wall. Below it fell away into a series of snow-covered ridges and deep crevasses. "May," Lynn called, cupping her hands around her mouth. The wind stole her voice, tossing it uselessly into the white void. Logic dictated that May would have been thrown in the same direction as their roll. Lynn began moving downslope, each step a battle against snow that reached her knees. The medical pack weighed heavily on her shoulders, but she couldn't leave it behind when she found May. The young nurse would need immediate treatment. 10 minutes into her search, Lynn spotted a splash of color against the white, a single red glove half buried in the snow. May's. Lynn's heart hammered as she rushed forward, nearly falling in her haste. But there was no body attached to the glove, just this lone piece of evidence that May had passed through here. Lynn pushed deeper into the storm, eyes straining for any sign of her colleague. The snow was falling so thickly now that visibility had decreased to less than 10 feet. She checked her watch again. 3:02 p.m. May had been exposed for 45 minutes. Critical threshold approaching. A dark shape loomed suddenly to her right, another stand of pines. Lynn veered toward them, reasoning that May might have sought shelter there. The trees offered minimal protection from the wind, but even that small mercy might have drawn an injured person. "May!" Lynn called again, voice growing hoarse. As if in answer, she heard a sound so faint she might have imagined it. Lynn froze, listening with every fiber of her being. There it was again, a small scratching noise. She moved toward it, ducking under snow-laden branches. There, huddled at the base of the largest pine, was a snow-covered mound that didn't belong. "May!" Lynn rushed forward, brushing snow away from a human form. The young nurse was curled into a tight ball, her skin alarmingly pale, lips tinged blue. "Lynn." May's voice was a broken whisper, her eyes unfocused. "Can't feel my hands." Lynn's training took over. She quickly assessed May's condition. Moderate to severe hypothermia, possible concussion from the impact. Frostbite beginning on exposed skin. No obvious broken bones, which was the only mercy in this situation. "I'm here now. You're going to be okay." Lynn spoke with a confidence she didn't entirely feel as she pulled emergency heat packs from her medical bag, cracking them to activate the chemical reaction. She tucked them against May's core, armpits, groin, neck, and wrapped her in the special reflective emergency blanket. "Where's Tom?" May asked, teeth chattering violently. "Back at the vehicle with a broken leg. Once you're stabilized, we'll get you there too. It's better shelter than these trees." Lynn checked her watch again. 3:17 p.m. Daylight would be gone within 2 hours, and temperatures would drop even further. They needed help, and soon. She pulled out the satellite phone again, climbing to her feet and walking a few paces away from the trees. Still no signal. Lynn climbed higher, slipping on the steep slope, fighting for every foot of elevation in hopes of clearing the interference. At the top of a small ridge, the phone finally showed a single bar of reception. Lynn dialed the emergency frequency with fingers numb from cold. "This is Dr. Lin Zhao, Frontier Medicine Team Alpha. Medical emergency. Vehicle accident on North Pass route to Whitetree. 3 personnel, 2 injured. Request immediate evac. Coordinates." She squinted at the GPS readout on the phone, reciting the numbers that would guide rescuers to their location. The response was broken. Staticky. Received. Unable. Blizzard conditions. Earliest tomorrow. The connection failed before Lynn could respond. But the message was clear enough. No help was coming, at least not until the storm cleared. They were on their own. Lynn looked back toward the trees where May lay, then up the slope toward the barely visible shape of their crashed vehicle where Tom waited. Night was approaching. The storm showed no signs of weakening, and she was now responsible for keeping all 3 of them alive until help could reach them. She took a deep breath of razor-sharp cold air and began to plan. They would need shelter, heat, and a way to signal rescuers when the storm finally broke. As a wave of dizziness washed over her, Lynn realized she'd hit her head harder than she'd thought in the crash. Ignoring her own growing pain, she turned back toward May. One step at a time. Get May to the vehicle. Treat Tom's leg properly. Build better shelter. Survive the night. Lynn didn't allow herself to think beyond these immediate tasks. Hope was a luxury they couldn't afford yet, not with so much work to be done just to see the dawn. The journey back to the crashed vehicle was a battle against nature itself. Lynn had fashioned a makeshift sled using branches and the emergency blanket, carefully securing May onto it. Each step was a victory. Each yard gained a small miracle as Lynn's muscles burned with the effort of pulling her colleague through the deepening snow. "Stay with me, May," Lynn said whenever the young nurse's eyes began to drift closed. "Tell me about your grandmother's cooking again." "Dumplings," May whispered, her voice barely audible above the howling wind. "She folded them. Like little moons. That's it. Keep talking." Lynn adjusted her grip on the branch handles, ignoring the blisters forming on her palms even through her gloves. The cold had a way of making every pain sharper, every burden heavier. It took nearly an hour to reach the vehicle, though the distance wasn't great. The snow had piled against its exposed underside, creating an odd, misshapen igloo. Lynn circled to the passenger side door, which now faced upward like a hatch. "Tom," she called, peering inside. A grunt answered her. Tom was still conscious, huddled under the emergency blankets she'd left him with. His face was gray with pain, but his eyes were clear and alert. "You found her," he said, relief evident in his voice when he spotted May on the sled. "She's in bad shape. Hypothermia, possible concussion." Lynn didn't sugarcoat it. They were all medical professionals. They understood the stakes. "We need to create better shelter before dark." The light was already fading, the white world turning blue as the sun retreated. They had perhaps an hour of workable daylight left. "The supply crates," Tom suggested, gesturing to the back of the vehicle where their medical supplies had been secured. "We can use them to build a windbreak." Lynn nodded, already working to get May safely inside the vehicle. "I got through to emergency services. Barely. They can't get to us until the storm breaks." Tom's face remained impassive, but Lynn saw the flicker of understanding in his eyes. They both knew what that meant. In these conditions, they might be on their own for days, not hours. Working methodically, Lynn arranged May next to Tom in the cramped space. The positioning was awkward due to the vehicle's angle, but at least they were out of the direct wind. Lynn passed her medical bag inside. "Check her vitals every 15 minutes, she instructed Tom. "Keep her wrapped tight. If she gets drowsy, make her talk." Tom nodded, already unzipping the bag with practiced movements despite the awkward angle. "What about you?" "I'm going to salvage what I can and build us a proper shelter." Lynn looked toward the stand of pines nearby. "We need branches for insulation and to create a frame." The next 40 minutes passed in a blur of purposeful activity. Lynn forced her tired body to keep moving, knowing that to stop was to surrender to the cold. She dragged the heavy supply crates from the vehicle, positioning them as a windbreak. She broke branches from the pines, ignoring the sticky sap that froze almost instantly on her gloves. She dug into the snow, creating a shallow depression that would serve as the floor of their shelter. The physical labor kept her warm despite the plummeting temperature, but Lynn knew this was temporary. As soon as she stopped moving, the cold would set in with a vengeance. By the time she had constructed a crude but effective lean-to against the side of the vehicle, using branches, crates, and packed snow, true darkness had fallen. The only light came from the eerie blue-white glow of snow, reflecting what little moonlight penetrated the storm clouds. Lynn crawled back into the vehicle to check on her patients. "Her temperature's up a bit," Tom reported, his voice tight with the pain he was clearly trying to hide. "Still too low, but the heat packs helped." "Good." Lynn dug through her pack, pulling out a bottle of pain medication. "Your turn." "These will help with the leg." Tom shook his head. "We need to ration supplies." "I can handle it." "You're no good to us if you go into shock from pain," Lynn countered, her tone leaving no room for argument. "Take them." "Doctor's orders." A ghost of a smile crossed Tom's face as he accepted the pills. "Yes, boss." Lynn checked his splint, relieved to find no signs of compartment syndrome developing. The break was bad but clean, a small mercy in their current situation. "We need to move to the shelter," she said after completing her examination. "It's more stable than the vehicle, and I've built it so we can have a small fire without suffocating ourselves." Moving Tom was a challenge that required all of Lynn's strength and his considerable tolerance for pain. By the time they had him positioned in the lean-to, sweat had frozen on Lynn's forehead despite the brutal cold. May was easier to move, but her continued lethargy worried Lynn. The young nurse responded to questions, but slowly, her usual quick wit dulled by cold and trauma. Once both patients were settled in the crude shelter, Lynn set about the vital task of creating heat. From her pack, she retrieved the emergency fire kit, waterproof matches, chemical fire starters, and a small folding saw. Working at the entrance of the shelter, she cut the driest branches she could find into small pieces. "Remember that wilderness training course last summer?" Tom asked, watching her work. "The instructor said you were the best fire starter he'd seen." Lynn smiled despite herself. "Only because you kept trying to use wet wood. Hey, it was my first time out of the city. Not all of us grew up with mountain ranger parents." This gentle banter was good. It kept them focused, kept the fear at bay. Lynn knew that morale could be as important as medicine in survival situations. The fire, when she finally coaxed it to life, seemed like a miracle. Its small flame cast dancing shadows on their makeshift walls, and the modest heat it provided felt like summer after the relentless cold. "Don't get too close," she warned as May instinctively reached toward the warmth. "Your skin won't register pain properly when it's this cold. You could burn yourself without realizing it." They huddled around the small fire, taking turns feeding it with the limited dry wood Lynn had collected. Outside, the storm continued unabated, snow piling against their shelter, actually helping to insulate them further. Lynn checked her watch, 8:42 p.m. They had survived the immediate danger, but the night ahead would be long and treacherous. She pulled out the satellite phone again, crawling to the entrance of the shelter to check for reception. Still nothing. The mountains and storm created a perfect communication blackout. "Any luck?" Tom asked when she returned to the fire. Lynn shook her head. "We'll try again in the morning. Maybe from higher ground." "If the storm breaks," May added quietly, speaking more clearly than she had since Lynn found her. The heat was helping her condition. "When the storm breaks," Lynn corrected gently. They ate sparingly from the emergency rations in Lynn's pack, high-calorie energy bars that tasted like cardboard but would help their bodies generate heat. Lynn made them each drink from her water bottle, knowing that dehydration was a silent danger in cold environments. As the night deepened, they established a watch rotation. Someone needed to stay awake to maintain the fire and monitor the others for signs of worsening condition. Lynn took the first shift, insisting that both Tom and May needed rest to recover from their injuries. Sitting awake while her colleagues slept fitfully, Lynn finally had time to assess her own condition. Her head throbbed where she'd hit it during the crash. Gingerly, she explored the area with her fingertips, finding a sizable lump but no open wound. A concussion, most likely, but not severe enough to incapacitate her. Her real concern was the cold that seemed to have settled into her very bones. Despite the fire, Lynn couldn't stop the occasional violent shiver that ran through her body. She was experiencing the early stages of hypothermia herself, but there was little she could do about it except stay as close to the fire as safety allowed. To keep herself alert, Lynn mentally reviewed their situation, cataloging resources and challenges with clinical precision. Resources: shelter, fire, some food and water, medical supplies, 3 trained medical professionals. Challenges: extreme cold, 2 injured team members, no communication, unknown rescue timeline. It wasn't an encouraging assessment, but Lynn had faced desperate situations before. During her residency, she'd worked the ER during a major earthquake. Later, with frontier medicine, she'd helped evacuate an entire village during catastrophic flooding. Compared to those events, this was just another problem to solve. A particularly strong gust of wind sent snow swirling into their shelter. Lynn quickly repositioned the branches at the entrance, packing fresh snow against them to seal the gap. When she turned back, she found May watching her with fever-bright eyes. "We're not going to make it, are we?" the young nurse asked, her voice small against the howling of the wind. Lynn moved to sit beside her, checking her pulse with practiced fingers. "Of course we are. We have shelter, heat, and each other. The storm will break eventually. I should never have come on this rotation, May whispered. I'm not cut out for this kind of medicine. That's the cold talking, Lynn said firmly. You're one of the most promising nurses I've worked with. When we get back, you'll laugh about thinking this way. May didn't look convinced, but she closed her eyes again, exhaustion claiming her. The night stretched on, each hour marked only by the dwindling of their firewood and the need to venture out for more. During Tom's watch, Lynn dozed fitfully. Her dreams filled with the sound of helicopter rotors that always remained just out of reach. She woke to find the fire dangerously low, and Tom slumped against the shelter wall, his face alarmingly pale in the dim light. Lynn scrambled to check his pulse, relief washing over her when she found it steady if a bit weak. Tom, she said sharply, shaking his shoulder. Tom, wake up. He startled awake, confusion momentarily clouding his features. Sorry. Got dizzy for a minute there. Lynn checked his leg, concerned that infection might be setting in despite her best efforts. The splint was holding well, but the skin around his ankle had taken on an angry red hue. I'm going for more wood, she decided, pulling her coat tighter around herself. Then I'll take over the watch. You need proper rest. Outside, the storm had weakened somewhat, though snow still fell steadily. The pre-dawn light gave the landscape an ethereal quality. Everything softened by fresh powder. Lynn gathered what branches she could find, breaking them with hands that felt clumsy and distant. As she worked, a sound reached her, faint but unmistakable. She straightened, heart suddenly hammering in her chest. There it was again, a mechanical whirring, almost lost in the wind. Lynn dropped the wood and scrambled to higher ground, scanning the still dark sky. Far in the distance, a pinprick of light moved against the clouds. Hope, which had been fading with each passing hour, suddenly blazed within her. Somewhere out there, against all protocol and probability, someone was flying through the remnants of the blizzard. Lynn pulled the satellite phone from her pocket, desperate to make contact. Still no signal. She looked down at her companions in the shelter, then back at the distant light. A decision crystallized in her mind. She would need to find a way to signal, to guide whoever was out there to their location, and she would need to do it quickly, before that small light disappeared back into the storm. Lynn's mind raced as she tracked the distant light moving across the dark sky. Years of emergency training kicked in, pushing aside exhaustion and cold. She needed something bright, something that would stand out against the endless white landscape. The flares. Every frontier medicine vehicle carried emergency flares in a lockbox bolted to the frame. If the box had survived the crash, Lynn half ran, half slid down the slope toward their overturned vehicle, her breath coming in sharp clouds. The growing light of dawn revealed the true extent of their situation. They were in a shallow valley surrounded by steep slopes, the crashed vehicle partially buried by drifting snow. No wonder their satellite phone couldn't connect. They were in a natural bowl, cut off from the world. She reached the vehicle and circled to what had been the rear bumper, now tilted awkwardly toward the sky. The lockbox was there, its red paint scratched but intact. Lynn fumbled with the combination lock, her fingers clumsy with cold. The numbers blurred before her eyes. Was it 4729 or 4927? Come on, she muttered, trying to focus. Failed attempt. The lock remained stubbornly closed. Lynn closed her eyes, picturing the safety manual she'd read a dozen times. Page 42, Emergency Equipment Codes. The image formed slowly in her mind. 4972. The lock clicked open on her next try. Inside were 4 road flares, a folding shovel, and a small mirror for signaling. Lynn grabbed all of it, stuffing the smaller items into her coat pockets and clutching the flares against her chest. The distant aircraft was still visible, making a slow sweep across the valley. They were searching for something or someone. Lynn's broken transmission must have gotten through after all. She needed higher ground, somewhere the signal flare would be visible for miles. Her gaze locked onto a rocky outcropping about 50 yards upslope from their shelter. It would do. Lynn began to climb, each step a battle against the deep snow and her own fading strength. The outcropping seemed to grow more distant with every labored step. A wave of dizziness washed over her and she stumbled, catching herself on a half-buried tree branch. The concussion from the crash was making itself known again, her vision swimming at the edges. Not now, she growled through gritted teeth, forcing herself upright. Not when we're so close. The aircraft's sound grew fainter. It was moving away, continuing its search pattern in another section of the vast wilderness. Lynn pushed harder, ignoring the fire in her lungs and the throbbing in her head. Finally, she reached the outcropping. From this vantage point, she could see for miles across the snow-covered mountains. The helicopter, she could see now that it was indeed a helicopter and not a plane, was nearly a mile away, its black shape stark against the lightening sky. Lynn pulled out the first flare with shaking hands. One chance. She had to make it count. She twisted the cap and struck the end of the flare against the rough activation strip. Nothing happened. The cap must have gotten damp. She tried again, pressing harder, her frozen fingers slipping on the plastic. On the third try, the flare burst to life with a fierce hiss, its brilliant red light almost blinding after so many hours of darkness. Lynn raised it high above her head, waving it in wide arcs, the universal signal of distress. "Here," she screamed, though she knew her voice couldn't possibly carry to the distant aircraft. "We're here." The helicopter continued its path away from them. Lynn's heart sank as the distance between them grew. The flare would burn for only a few minutes, not long enough if the pilot didn't happen to look in her direction. Then, like a miracle, the helicopter banked. It changed course, turning in a wide arc that brought its nose pointing toward her position. It had seen the flare. Lynn let out a laugh that was half sob. She waved the flare more vigorously, ignoring the hot ash that occasionally fell on her coat sleeve. The helicopter was definitely coming toward her now, growing larger against the sky. As it approached, Lynn could make out more details. It wasn't a standard rescue helicopter with bright orange markings. This one was matte black with no identifying symbols, an unmarked medevac, possibly military or private contractor. In these remote regions, rescue resources were often cobbled together from whatever was available. Lynn didn't care who they were as long as they could get her team to a hospital. She continued signaling until the helicopter was directly overhead, hovering about 100 feet above her position. The downdraft from its rotors whipped the loose snow into a blinding cloud around her. She pointed urgently toward the lean-to where Tom and May waited, making the universal gesture for injured people by crossing her arms over her chest, then pointing again. The pilot acknowledged with a slight dip of the nose before beginning to circle, looking for a place to land in the treacherous terrain. Lynn's legs finally gave out. She sank to her knees in the snow, the still-burning flare clutched in her hand. They were saved. Against all odds, someone had come for them. The helicopter eventually found a relatively flat area about 200 yards from their shelter. Lynn watched as it settled onto the snow with agonizing slowness, its skids sinking slightly into the powder. The rotors continued to spin, kicking up a perpetual storm of white. The side door slid open and a figure jumped out, crouching low beneath the still-turning blades. The person was wearing a flight suit with a medical pack slung across their shoulders. Even from this distance, Lynn could tell from their movements that this was someone with both military and medical training, someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Lynn struggled to her feet. Waving the flare one last time before tossing it safely aside in the snow, she began making her way down from the outcropping, half sliding in her haste to reach the newcomer. They met halfway between the helicopter and the shelter. The rescue medic, a woman with dark hair pulled back in a tight braid, assessed Lynn with a quick professional glance. "Captain Layla Abadi," she shouted over the noise of the helicopter. "Private medical transport. You the one who sent the distress call?" Lynn nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. The relief of seeing another human being, someone who could help them, was overwhelming. Dr. Lin Zhao, Frontier Medicine. 2 injured in the shelter, broken leg and hypothermia with possible concussion. "Our vehicle went off the pass yesterday afternoon." Captain Abadi nodded sharply. "Show me." Together they made their way to the lean-to. The captain moved with swift efficiency, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, assessing threats and resources with what was clearly years of experience. "Wasn't sure anyone would find us," Lynn admitted as they walked. "The storm—" "We almost didn't," Abadi replied. "Your transmission was fragmented. Had about a 50-mile search radius to cover, and these mountains don't make it easy." She glanced at Lynn. "You're lucky I decided to bend a few rules about flying in these conditions." Inside the shelter, Tom and May looked up with identical expressions of disbelief as Lynn entered with their rescuer. "Told you we'd make it," Lynn said to May, whose eyes filled with tears of relief. Captain Abadi wasted no time. She knelt beside Tom first, quickly examining his splinted leg. Clean break, good field dressing, she commented, nodding her approval to Lynn. But we need to get you to surgery sooner rather than later. She moved to May next, checking her pupils and pulse. Mild hypothermia, improving. Any loss of sensation in fingers or toes? May shook her head. Not anymore. Dr. Zhao found me before frostbite set in. You got lucky, Abadi said bluntly. She turned to Lynn. My co-pilot and I can carry the man with the broken leg. Can you help your other colleague walk to the helicopter? Lynn nodded, though the simple act sent another wave of dizziness through her. Captain Abadi noticed, her sharp eyes narrowing. You're injured too, she stated rather than asked. Just a bump on the head from the crash. I'm fine. Abadi looked skeptical but didn't argue. Let's move. We've got a weather window of about 2 hours before another front moves in. I'd rather not be stuck here when it hits. The captain stepped outside and signaled to the helicopter. The co-pilot emerged, jogging toward them with a collapsible stretcher. Moving Tom was a painful process. Despite the rescue team's expertise, every slight jostle sent spasms of agony across his face. Lynn whispered encouragement as they secured him to the stretcher, her heart aching for her colleague's suffering. May was steadier on her feet than Lynn had expected, though she leaned heavily on Lynn's shoulder as they made their slow way toward the waiting helicopter. The young nurse looked back once at their improvised shelter. I didn't think I'd leave that place alive, she confessed quietly, her words nearly lost in the wind. But you did, Lynn reminded her. Remember that whenever things seem impossible. Captain Abadi and her co-pilot loaded Tom into the helicopter first, securing his stretcher to the floor mounts with practiced movements. Lynn helped May climb aboard next, settling her into one of the jump seats against the wall. As Lynn made to climb in herself, another wave of dizziness struck stronger than before. The world tilted alarmingly and she stumbled, catching herself on the helicopter's doorframe. Whoa there, Captain Abadi said, suddenly at her side, strong hands steadying her. How long since that head injury? About 18 hours, Lynn admitted, the numbers feeling strangely hard to calculate. And you've been moving, working, staying awake most of that time? Abadi's tone had changed, professional concern evident in her voice. Lynn nodded, immediately regretting the motion as nausea washed over her. Classic concussion, probably moderate to severe, Abadi muttered. She helped Lynn into the helicopter, settling her onto the remaining jump seat. I'm starting an IV, your color's bad, and I'm betting you're dehydrated on top of everything else. Lynn didn't argue. The captain's assessment was correct, and now that rescue had arrived, her body seemed determined to remind her of every abuse it had suffered in the past 18 hours. As Abadi deftly inserted an IV line into her arm, Lynn looked over at her teammates. Tom's pain seemed slightly less acute now that he was lying flat with proper medical attention. May had already fallen into an exhausted sleep, her head lolling against the helicopter's vibrating wall. They're going to be okay, Abadi said, following Lynn's gaze. Thanks to you. She hung an IV bag from a hook above Lynn's head and adjusted the flow rate. Now let someone else be the doctor for a while. The helicopter lifted off with a lurch that made Lynn's stomach twist. Through the small window, she watched their crash site recede, the wrecked vehicle and makeshift shelter growing smaller, until they were just tiny dark specks in a world of white. Captain Abadi settled into the seat across from her, checking something on a tablet computer. We're about 40 minutes from the regional hospital in Coldridge. They're prepped and waiting for us, Lynn nodded, careful to move only minimally. How did you find us? The coordinates in my transmission were incomplete. Abadi looked up, a slight smile crossing her face for the first time. Used to fly search and rescue in Afghanistan. Got pretty good at finding people who didn't want to be found. Finding people who do want to be found? She shrugged. Just had to think like a doctor on a relief mission. The Northern Pass is the only way to reach those villages this time of year. You took a big risk flying in that storm, Lynn observed. Calculated risk, Abadi corrected. Like your decision to leave your shelter to signal us instead of waiting to be found. She studied Lynn with newfound respect. Sometimes rules need to be broken to save lives. As the helicopter carried them toward safety, Lynn felt the tension of the past day finally beginning to ease. They weren't out of danger yet. Tom would need surgery, May needed observation, and her own concussion was clearly worse than she'd admitted to herself. But they had survived the worst. She looked out the window at the vast wilderness below them, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. Somewhere out there, another medical team would be dispatched to complete their mission, to bring supplies to the isolated villages that depended on frontier medicine. The work would continue. Lynn's eyes grew heavy as exhaustion and the gentle sway of the helicopter conspired to lull her towards sleep. The last thing she saw before her eyes closed was Captain Abadi, watchful and alert, her hands steady on the medical equipment that was helping keep them all alive. Lynn awoke to the rhythmic beeping of hospital monitors. For a moment she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. The sterile white ceiling above her was a stark contrast to the snow-laden branches of their makeshift shelter. "Welcome back," a familiar voice said from nearby. Lynn turned her head carefully, mindful of the lingering pain, to find Captain Abadi sitting in a chair beside her bed. The pilot had changed out of her flight suit into civilian clothes, dark jeans and a simple gray sweater that somehow still managed to look as crisp and professional as a uniform. "How long was I out?" Lynn asked, her voice rough from sleep and dehydration. "About 6 hours. The doctors gave you something for the pain that knocked you right out." Abadi leaned forward slightly, which was probably for the best considering you'd been running on pure adrenaline for nearly a day. Memories of the rescue flooded back, the helicopter ride, arriving at the hospital, being wheeled through bright corridors while trying to give the medical staff information about Tom and May. After that, everything went blank. My team? Lynn pushed herself up on her elbows, ignoring the wave of dizziness the movement triggered. "Easy," Abadi cautioned, standing to adjust Lynn's pillows. "They're both stable. Your colleague Tom is out of surgery. Clean break in 2 places, they put in some pins. He'll be off his feet for a while, but the surgeon expects a full recovery." Relief washed through Lynn. "And May, the young nurse, being treated for hypothermia and exhaustion, but her doctors are optimistic. No permanent damage from the cold." Abadi settled back into her chair. "You did good work out there. Another few hours and we might be having a very different conversation." Lynn closed her eyes briefly, allowing herself to truly feel the weight of what they'd survived. "Thank you for finding us. I still don't understand how you did it with such incomplete information." Abadi's expression remained neutral, but Lynn caught a flicker of something, pride perhaps, in her eyes. "I've been flying these mountains for 3 years now. After Afghanistan it seemed quieter, most of the time." She paused, considering her words. "When your transmission came through all broken and static, it reminded me of calls I used to get from units pinned down in remote valleys." "So you just flew into a blizzard on a hunch?" Lynn couldn't keep the amazement from her voice. A small smile crossed Abadi's face. "The weather reports showed a brief clearing coming. I gambled that I could use that window to find you before the next front hit." She shrugged as if it had been a minor decision, and not one that risked her life and her career. "Besides, technically I was already on standby for emergency medical transport." Just expanded the definition of emergency a bit. A nurse entered before Lynn could respond, carrying a clipboard and a small cup of water. "Dr. Zhao, good to see you awake." "I'm Nurse Chen, how's the head feeling?" "Like someone's using it for drum practice," Lynn admitted. "That tracks with the CT scan results. Moderate concussion, but no bleeding or swelling that we need to worry about." Nurse Chen handed her the water, small sips. "You're still dehydrated despite the IV fluids." Lynn followed the instructions, the cool water soothing her parched throat. "When can I see my teammates?" "Tom's still in recovery, but May's been asking about you. Once I check your vitals, you could probably manage a short visit by wheelchair." "The Nobari." Iris gave a pointed look at Abadi. "Though Captain Abadi was supposed to call us when you woke up, not start debriefing you." Abadi raised her hands in surrender. Guilty as charged. After the nurse completed her examination and left with a promise to return with a wheelchair, Lynn turned back to Abadi. "You stayed," she observed. "All this time." Something flashed across Abadi's face. Discomfort, perhaps, at having her actions noted. "Standard procedure to follow up on rescues. Besides, I needed your first-hand account for my incident report." Lynn sensed there was more to it than professional obligation, but she didn't press. "Of course. What do you need to know?" For the next 15 minutes, Abadi asked detailed questions about the crash, their survival efforts, and the injuries they'd sustained. Lynn answered as thoroughly as she could. though certain moments from the ordeal had already begun to blur together in her memory. "One last question," Abadi said, putting away the small recorder she'd been using. "The satellite phone. You mentioned getting a broken transmission through. What exactly did you say?" Lynn frowned, trying to recall her exact words. "Our call sign, location on North Pass, medical emergency, 3 personnel, 2 injured." And I started to give coordinates, but the connection cut out. Abadi nodded slowly. "That matches what we received. Just fragments, really. Medical, North Pass, 3 personnel. Almost nothing to go on." "Yet you found us anyway," Lynn said softly. "Like I said, I had a hunch." Abadi stood as Nurse Chen returned with a wheelchair. "I should file my report. The hospital has my contact information if you think of anything else relevant." There was a finality to her tone that suggested their interaction was coming to an end. Lynn felt a strange reluctance to see the captain leave. This woman had saved their lives, had bent rules, and risked herself to find them when rational protocol would have waited for better conditions. "Captain," Lynn called as Abadi reached the door, "I'd like to thank you properly once I'm discharged." "Maybe coffee?" Abadi paused, looking back with slight surprise. "I was just doing my job, Doctor. Flying into a blizzard on incomplete information isn't in anyone's job description," Lynn countered. "At least let me buy you a cup of coffee. Professional courtesy." After a moment's hesitation, Abadi nodded. "Get some rest, Dr. Zhao. I'll check in before you're discharged." With Abadi gone, Nurse Chen helped Lynn into the wheelchair, adjusting the IV pole to roll alongside them. "She hasn't left the hospital since bringing you 3 in," the nurse commented casually as she pushed Lynn down the corridor. "Refused to be relieved by her co-pilot. Said she wanted to be sure you all pulled through." Lynn absorbed this information silently. It seemed there was more to Captain Abadi than professional duty after all. May's room was just down the hall. The young nurse was propped up in bed, looking far better than when Lynn had last seen her. Her color had returned, and the haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by alert curiosity. "Dr. Zhao," May's face lit up when Lynn was wheeled in. "They wouldn't tell me anything except that you were resting." Lynn smiled, genuine warmth spreading through her chest at seeing her colleague recovering well. "Just a hard knock on the head. Nothing that won't heal." She gestured for Nurse Chen to position her wheelchair beside May's bed. "How are you feeling?" "Like I've been hit by a truck, then frozen, then thawed out too quickly," May said with surprising humor. "But the doctors say there's no lasting damage. No frostbite, no internal injuries." Her expression sobered. "They said if you hadn't found me when you did—" "But I did," Lynn cut in gently. "That's what matters." May reached out to grasp Lynn's hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "You saved my life out there. Yours and Tom's. I've been lying here thinking about how I almost gave up, how I told you I wasn't cut out for this kind of medicine." "The cold and shock talking," Lynn reminded her. "Not you." "Maybe," May acknowledged. "But it made me realize something. I don't want to just survive this. I want to learn from it." Her eyes shone with determination. "I want to train in wilderness medicine, emergency response. I want to be the one who knows what to do next time." Lynn squeezed May's hand. "You'll make an excellent emergency responder." They talked for a while longer, reviewing their ordeal from both perspectives. May described the terrifying moments after being thrown from the vehicle, how she'd tried to call out, but found her voice stolen by the wind, how she'd crawled toward the trees seeking any shelter from the relentless cold. "Have you seen Tom?" Lynn asked eventually. May shook her head. "Not since we arrived. But the nurses said his surgery went well." She hesitated. "That pilot who found us, she's been checking on both of us regularly. Seems like she feels responsible for us somehow." "Captain Abadi," Lynn supplied. "She took a significant risk coming after us in those conditions." "She reminds me of you," May observed. "That same intensity, like when something needs doing, nothing's going to stand in the way." Lynn was saved from responding when Nurse Chen returned to take her back to her room. The brief visit had tired her more than she'd expected, and the pounding in her head had intensified. Back in her hospital bed, Lynn found her thoughts returning to Captain Abadi. There was something compelling about the pilot's quiet competence, her willingness to take calculated risks when lives were at stake. In her years with frontier medicine, Lynn had met many professionals dedicated to saving lives. but few with a body's particular blend of skill and instinct. The next day brought improvements for all 3 team members. Tom was finally awake and alert after his surgery, cracking weak jokes about trading his medical rotation for a vacation on a beach somewhere. May continued to regain her strength, already making notes about wilderness medicine certification courses she wanted to take. Lynn's concussion symptoms began to ease, though the doctors cautioned her about returning to work too quickly. Brain injuries are deceptive, Dr. Rivera warned during morning rounds. You'll feel fine, then push too hard and set yourself back weeks. By afternoon, Lynn had been cleared to walk short distances. She made her way slowly to Tom's room, where she found him propped up in bed, his leg elevated in a complex arrangement of braces and bandages. There she is. Tom grinned when she entered. Our very own mountain rescue expert. Lynn settled carefully into the visitor's chair. How's the pain? Manageable thanks to the wonders of modern pharmaceuticals. He gestured toward his elevated leg. They say I'll be on crutches for at least 2 months, maybe more. No more field rotations for a while. We'll keep your place on the team, Lynn assured him. Once you're cleared for duty. Tom's expression turned serious. I've been thinking about that. Maybe it's time for me to transition to something a bit less extreme. The regional hospital in my hometown has been trying to recruit me for their ER. After this, he indicated his leg. I'm considering it. Lynn nodded, understanding. Near-death experiences had a way of clarifying priorities. You'd make an excellent ER doctor. What about you? Tom asked. Will you stay with frontier medicine after this? The question caught Lynn off guard. She hadn't considered that her path might change because of what they'd endured. I think so. There's still so much need in these remote communities. Tom studied her face. You know, when we were out there in that makeshift shelter, freezing and waiting for help that might never come, I watched you. Never once did you show doubt or fear. It was like you were exactly where you were meant to be, doing exactly what you were meant to do even in those terrible circumstances. Lynn didn't know how to respond to that. She'd been terrified the entire time, certain that every decision could mean life or death for her team. But perhaps there was truth in what Tom said. A certain clarity that came with that level of urgency and purpose. Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Captain Abadi stood in the doorway, this time in her flight suit. Sorry to interrupt, she said. I'm being called out on another transport. Wanted to check in before I left. Captain, Tom greeted her warmly. Please come in. I haven't had a chance to thank you properly for fishing us out of that snowbank. Abadi entered, her posture military straight even in the casual setting of the hospital room. Just glad we found you in time. She glanced at Lynn. You're looking better, Doctor. Feeling better, Lynn confirmed, though apparently not well enough to escape the hospital yet. Head injuries are tricky, Abadi said with the voice of experience. Better to be cautious. A comfortable silence fell between the 3 of them, united by their shared experience despite having known each other for less than 48 hours. I should go, Abadi said finally. Duty calls? Another rescue? Tom asked. Medical transport. Much more routine than pulling stubborn doctors out of blizzards. The captain's normally serious expression softened slightly with something like humor. She turned to Lynn. About that coffee, Dr. Zhao. I'm on rotation for the next week, but after that, I'll be here, Lynn assured her, or at the Frontier Medicine office in town. With a nod that somehow conveyed both acknowledgement and promise, Captain Abadi left. Tom raised his eyebrows at Lynn. Coffee? Lynn felt an unexpected warmth in her cheeks. Professional courtesy. She did save our lives. Uh-huh, Tom said, clearly unconvinced but smiling. Professional. Later that evening, as Lynn stood at her hospital room window watching the sun set over mountains that had nearly claimed their lives, she reflected on how quickly life could change. 3 days ago, she'd been leading a routine medical mission. Then came the crash, the desperate fight for survival, and the against-all-odds rescue. Now, standing here with new perspectives and perhaps new directions forming, Lynn felt strangely at peace. They had survived. More than that, they had each found something of value in their ordeal. May her calling for emergency medicine, Tom his clarity about his future path, and Lynn wasn't yet sure what she had found, but watching the fading light paint the mountains in shades of purple and gold, she felt certain it would become clear soon enough. 3 weeks after the crash, Lynn stood at the edge of the hospital's helipad, watching as Captain Abadi's Unmarked Medevac touched down with practiced precision. The rotor wash whipped at her coat and sent her hair flying, but Lynn hardly noticed. She'd been looking forward to this day more than she cared to admit. The past weeks had been a blur of recovery and paperwork. Lynn had been discharged after 4 days, though the doctors had ordered 2 weeks of rest before returning to light duty. Tom remained in the hospital for physical therapy, his leg healing well but requiring specialized care. May had thrown herself into wilderness emergency training with surprising enthusiasm, already certified in 2 new life-saving protocols. As for Lynn, her physical recovery had progressed smoothly, but her mind kept returning to those desperate hours in the snow, and to the woman who had flown through a storm to find them. The helicopter powered down, its rotors slowing to a visible spin before stopping completely. The side door slid open, and Captain Abadi stepped out, moving with the easy confidence Lynn had come to associate with her. Today she wasn't in her flight suit, but instead wore dark pants and a blue button-up shirt under a leather jacket. Off duty then. Dr. Zhao, Abadi called as she approached, her expression warming. Good to see you on your feet. Lynn, please, she responded, extending her hand. I think pulling someone from a frozen mountainside puts us on a first-name basis. Abadi took her hand, her grip firm and warm. Layla, then. They stood for a moment, hands clasped perhaps a beat longer than necessary, before Lynn gestured toward the hospital exit. I believe I owe you coffee. The cafe across from the hospital was quiet at this mid-afternoon hour. They found a corner table away from the windows where the late winter sunlight streamed in without being blinding. How's the head? Layla asked once they'd settled with their drinks. Black coffee for her, tea with honey for Lynn. Better. No more headaches, though loud noises can still be a problem. Lynn wrapped her hands around the warm mug. The doctors cleared me for part-time work next week. And will you be heading back out to those remote villages right away? There was something in Layla's tone. Concern, perhaps, or simple curiosity. Lynn shook her head. Not for field rotations, not yet. I'll be working from the regional office for a while, coordinating supply chains. She smiled slightly. Apparently nearly dying in a blizzard earns you some desk time. Layla nodded, understanding in her eyes. After tough missions in Afghanistan, they'd ground us for a few weeks. Called it administrative leave, but everyone knew it was to give our heads time to settle. Is that what I need? Time for my head to settle? Lynn hadn't meant to ask the question aloud, but now that it hung between them, she was curious about Layla's answer. The pilot considered this, taking a slow sip of her coffee before responding. I think, when you've stared death in the face, it changes something fundamental, not always in a bad way, but it requires recalibration. Recalibration, Lynn repeated softly. That's exactly it. Like my internal compass is spinning, trying to find true north again. Have you spoken with a counselor? Layla asked. The hospital has good ones. I've used them myself. Lynn raised an eyebrow in surprise. Layla seemed so composed, so in control. You have? A shadow crossed Layla's face. Lost 3 crew members and 2 patients in a sandstorm 5 years ago. Couldn't fly for months afterward. Talking helped me find my way back to the cockpit. Lynn nodded slowly. She hadn't considered therapy. In her line of work, pushing through difficulty was the expected response. But if someone as clearly capable as Layla had sought help, I'll think about it, she promised. Their conversation shifted to lighter topics. Lynn learned that Layla had grown up in Lebanon before moving to the States for college, that she'd joined the military to pay for medical school, but had fallen in love with flying instead. Layla learned that Lynn came from a family of doctors but had chosen rural medicine, to the dismay of her hospital administrator parents. They wanted you to specialize? Surgery, perhaps? Layla guessed. Lynn laughed. Cardiology like my father. Or neurology like my mother. Something prestigious with regular hours and a corner office. Instead, you chose blizzards and makeshift shelters. And the occasional dramatic helicopter rescue, Lynn added with a smile. As they talked, Lynn realized that the unnatural stillness she'd felt since the accident was finally beginning to thaw. Something about Layla's presence, her quiet confidence, her understated strength, made Lynn feel more grounded than she had in weeks. Tell me about your work, Lynn said. The unmarked helicopter, the private medical transport. It seems unusual. Layla's expression grew more guarded. It's a specialized service. Some medical missions require discretion, like flying into a blizzard against protocol. A small smile. Sometimes. Let's just say there are patients and medical personnel who need transport without drawing attention. Remote researchers, private security details, certain government operations. She shrugged. We fill a niche that standard emergency services can't always cover. Lynn sensed there was more to the story, but didn't press. Everyone had their professional boundaries. I've been meaning to ask, Lynn said instead. That night, how did you actually find us? Even with your knowledge of the area, we were pretty well hidden in that valley. Layla set down her coffee cup, her eyes meeting Lynn's directly. The truth? When we got your broken transmission, protocol said to wait until morning when the storm cleared. But something in your voice, the way you said medical emergency, it reminded me of doctors I'd worked with in combat zones. That particular tone that says lives are hanging by a thread. She paused, looking slightly embarrassed by the admission. So I checked the weather patterns, found a potential window where visibility might improve, and took off. My co-pilot thought I was crazy. He wasn't wrong, Lynn said gently. Perhaps not, Layla acknowledged. But I've learned to trust my instincts. And when I saw your flare, she trailed off, shaking her head slightly. Let's just say I was relieved to be right. Their coffee date extended to dinner at a small restaurant nearby, neither woman ready to end their conversation. As they shared a meal, Lynn found herself telling Layla about her fears during those long hours in the snow. Not just fear for her patients' lives, but the deeper fear of failing them, of making a wrong decision that would cost someone everything. That's the burden of responsibility, Layla said, understanding in her eyes. Whether you're flying a helicopter or treating patients, other people's lives are in your hands. That weight never really gets lighter. You just grow stronger to carry it. By the time they left the restaurant, night had fallen, the street lamps casting pools of light on the sidewalk. Lynn hesitated at the corner where they would need to part ways. Layla to her temporary quarters at the airfield. Lynn to her apartment near the Frontier Medicine office. I'm glad you bent the rules to find us, Lynn said finally, her breath visible in the cold air. I'm glad you were stubborn enough to keep your team alive until I got there, Layla countered, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. There was a charged moment between them full of unspoken possibilities. Then Layla reached out and gently touched Lynn's arm. I have a 3-day rotation starting tomorrow, but after that, I'd like to see you again. Lynn felt warmth spread through her chest despite the winter chill. I'd like that too. The next morning brought unexpected news. The director of Frontier Medicine called Lynn personally to discuss a new initiative. A partnership with private medical transport services to improve emergency response in the most remote areas. They needed someone to develop protocols, training programs, and communication systems between the two organizations. We thought of you immediately, Dr. Zhao, the director said. Your recent experience makes you uniquely qualified. Plus, you've already established rapport with one of their key pilots. Lynn was speechless for a moment. How did you know about that? Captain Abadi contacted us. Said your team's ordeal highlighted critical gaps in our emergency response system. She was quite persuasive about the need for this partnership. After the call ended, Lynn stood by her window, watching snowflakes drift down from a clear blue sky. Nothing like the blizzard that had nearly claimed their lives. Just a gentle reminder of winter's presence. 2 months later, Lynn stood on that same mountain pass where their vehicle had crashed, now cleared of snow in the early spring thaw. Beside her, Layla surveyed the steep slope with professional interest. Hard to believe we found you in these conditions, she commented, gesturing toward the rugged terrain. If you hadn't built that shelter and signaled when you did? Lynn nodded, the memory still vivid despite the passage of time. I've been thinking about that moment when I saw your helicopter. How close we came to missing each other. The joint emergency response program they'd developed was already showing results. 3 successful rescues in the past month alone, with response times cut nearly in half. Tom had recovered enough to join the training team, teaching vehicle extraction techniques from his own experience. May had completed her wilderness medicine certification and now served as liaison between the hospital and field teams. As for Lynn and Layla, their professional collaboration had blossomed into something more personal. They moved in complementary orbits. Layla in the air, Lynn on the ground, both dedicated to the same mission of bringing help to those who needed it most. Ready to head back? Layla asked, glancing at her watch. They had a training session scheduled with new recruits that afternoon. Lynn took one last look at the mountain that had nearly taken everything from her but had instead given her a new direction. New purpose and unexpected connection. Ready, she confirmed, turning toward their waiting vehicle. As they drove away, Lynn reflected on how completely her life had changed since that desperate day in the snow. The path forward wasn't always clear. There would be other storms, other challenges to face. But she was no longer facing them alone. Sometimes hope faded, only to resurface in unexpected forms. Sometimes rescue came in unmarked helicopters, piloted by those willing to break the rules for the right reasons. And sometimes the darkest moments led to the brightest possibilities, if you just held on long enough to see them appear on the horizon.